My name is Grace Ellington, and I never imagined that one day my own daughter would look me in the eye in front of her friends and scream at me, "Stay out of our lives." The words were sharp, cold, and final, like a door slamming shut on a lifetime of memories. For a moment, the room froze. I could feel every pair of eyes turn toward me, some filled with pity, others with discomfort. I stood there with a polite smile plastered on my face, but inside it felt as though something had cracked open. My chest burned, not with anger, but with the kind of hurt that leaves you silent. I had shown up that evening at her invitation, or so I thought. Her friends were gathered in her spacious living room, wine glasses in hand, laughter echoing until my presence shifted the air. I'd brought a tray of her favorite homemade cookies, the same ones I used to make when she was little, believing that a small gesture of love might still mean something. But instead of gratitude, I was met with hostility. She rolled her eyes at me, then snapped in front of everyone, "Why are you always interfering? Just stay out of our lives." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat tightened as the laughter resumed awkwardly, conversations picking up again like nothing had happened. I placed the tray down on the counter quietly, my hands trembling just slightly, and stepped back into the shadow of the room. It was strange how fast my mind began rewinding the clock. I remembered the nights I stayed up with her when she was sick, the mornings I walked to work in the pouring rain, just to afford her piano lessons, the endless sacrifices I made so she would never feel the absence of her father. I had always been there, always. As the evening wore on, I realized she avoided looking at me completely, as though I were an intruder in her home. I listened as she chatted with her friends about weekend getaways and future plans. Plans I wasn't part of, had never been part of. By the time I left, the cookies were untouched. Walking to my car, I felt an eerie calm. The kind that comes right after you've been cut so deeply that pain no longer has a voice. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, the streetlights flickering outside, and thought about how easily we convince ourselves that love is unconditional. But what happens when you realize it isn't? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, playing her words over and over in my head. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood something I had been too blind to see. I was no longer wanted in her life. I could hear my own breathing, steady and controlled, as though my body knew what my heart had not yet accepted. I would not fight for a place where I was treated like an inconvenience. The next morning, I woke up, made myself a simple cup of tea, and stared at the framed photo on my kitchen counter, me and her at her college graduation. Her arms wrapped tightly around me, her smile full of pride. I whispered to myself, maybe it's time to let go. But even then, a part of me still believed she might call, might apologize, might remember who I had been to her all her life. She never did. Before I continue, tell me, have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own family? Have you ever loved someone so deeply only to realize they saw you as a burden? Share your story with me in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone. I didn't hear from my daughter for days after that night. The silence itself was an answer louder than any words she could have spoken. Each morning I checked my phone, half expecting a message that never came. The sting wasn't just in what she had said, but in what she chose not to do afterward. I went through my daily routines as if nothing had happened, making my tea, tending to my small garden, and reading on the porch, where the morning sun still felt warm. But beneath that quiet surface, I felt a hollowness spreading inside me. The words "stay out of our lives" kept circling in my head, replaying like a cruel refrain. For 72 years, I had prided myself on being a mother who never abandoned her child, no matter how hard life got. When her father walked out on us, I carried the weight alone. I took on extra shifts at the library, pinched pennies to buy her school supplies, and went without new clothes for years so she could have what she needed. I thought that sacrifice built unbreakable love. But love, I was learning, could be rewritten. I started noticing just how long this had been coming. Her sharp tone in recent years when I'd offer advice. The way she'd sigh when I asked if I could spend time with my grandson. The polite but empty smiles at family gatherings as if she were humoring me rather than embracing me. Those small wounds had added up. I had been bleeding silently for years without realizing it. 3 days after the outburst, I drove to the park near my home, the one with the little lake where we used to feed ducks when she was a child. Sitting on a bench, I pulled out an old photograph from my wallet, her 6th birthday party. She was missing her front teeth, grinning at the homemade cake I had baked, her eyes full of joy and trust. I traced my finger along her tiny face in the picture and wondered where that little girl had gone. When had she turned into someone who looked at me not as her mother, but as an inconvenience? That night, as I prepared for bed, I overheard a voicemail on my answering machine. It was my daughter's voice, casual, detached. "Hey, just so you know, we're busy this weekend. Don't drop by. We've got plans with friends." No apology, no acknowledgement of what she had said. I sat in the dark for a long time after listening to that message. And then, for the first time in my life, I thought, maybe she really doesn't need me anymore. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a strange clarity, like a fog lifting. I realized that I had spent my entire life hoping that love would be returned simply because I had earned it. But love isn't earned. Love is chosen. And she had stopped choosing me a long time ago. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling fan slowly spinning above me and whispered, "I think it's time." It was the first time I allowed myself to consider leaving, not out of spite, not as punishment, but as an act of quiet self-respect. I wasn't sure what leaving would look like yet, but a seed had been planted that night. For the first time, the idea of living my life for myself, without waiting for her approval, her invitation, her acknowledgement, felt possible. I didn't know it yet, but that single thought would grow into the decision that would change everything. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden light into my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands resting on my lap, and realized how empty the house felt. It had been quiet for years, but that day the silence felt different, final, almost suffocating. I made myself a simple breakfast. Toast and tea, the same routine I had followed for decades. Yet as I sat at the table, my mind drifted back to the years when mornings were anything but quiet. I remembered packing her lunchbox, braiding her hair while she squirmed impatiently in the chair, and rushing out the door to get her to school on time before heading to my own job at the library. I had lived those years in constant motion, juggling responsibilities, always putting her needs before mine. There were nights when I stayed awake grading papers after long library shifts, then sewing her recital costumes because we couldn't afford to buy them. I had been both mother and father, comforter and disciplinarian, provider and protector. I used to believe those sacrifices would matter forever. I reached for my old photo albums stacked in the living room cabinet. The leather covers were worn, the pages slightly yellowed with age. As I flipped through them, my heart ached at the sight of our memories. The camping trips, the homemade birthday cakes, the look of pure trust in her eyes when she was little. I ran my hand across one picture in particular. The two of us sitting on the library steps, her tiny hand clutching a stack of books almost as tall as she was. She had always loved stories, fairy tales, mysteries, adventures. I had spent countless nights reading to her, believing those moments were shaping her into someone kind, someone who would always remember where she came from. But life doesn't guarantee returns on love. Somewhere along the way, she had grown up, and I had grown old, and the bridge between us had crumbled without me noticing. By afternoon, I found myself standing in my bedroom closet staring at my belongings. My dresses, my coats, the shoes I rarely wore anymore. For the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to pack them up, to simply go. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I finally realized that staying enduring her disdain was hurting me more than leaving ever could. I whispered aloud as though saying it would make it real. "I don't deserve to feel unwanted in my own family." The words hung in the air, heavy but liberating. That night before going to bed, I opened my journal, the same one I'd written in for decades, and wrote, "Maybe love means knowing when to walk away." I stared at those words for a long time. They didn't feel bitter. They felt honest. And in that quiet moment, I knew I had already made my choice. The following week, I started to notice how many small ways I had been quietly pushed aside. There had been the family barbecue last summer, where no one told me the time had changed, and I showed up just as everyone was leaving. The Christmas morning when they opened presents without me saying they didn't want to wake me too early. And the countless dinners where I sat at the far end of the table listening, more than speaking, smiling so no one would think I felt out of place. At first, I had dismissed those moments as accidents or misunderstandings. But now, replaying them in my mind, I could see the truth my daughter had been creating distance for years. I decided to test something. That Thursday, I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't check in about my grandson's piano lesson or ask if she needed help with the groceries. I simply stayed silent, and she never reached out. The absence of contact was both painful and revealing. I realized that our relationship existed only because I had been the one holding it together. Without my efforts, it simply fell apart. That evening, as I sat by the window watching the neighborhood children play, I thought about how my life had become so small, reduced to waiting for phone calls that rarely came, clinging to memories that no longer mattered to anyone but me. I began sorting through my belongings one drawer at a time. Old letters, family recipes, a small box of keepsakes I had been saving for her. I ran my fingers over a pair of baby shoes I'd kept since she took her first steps. For years, I'd imagined passing them down to her own child one day. But as I held them in my hands now, I felt a sharp realization she didn't value these pieces of our past the way I did. I placed the shoes back in the box and whispered, "Maybe it's time to choose who deserves them." That night, I sat at my desk and opened my filing cabinet. Bank statements, property deeds, and my will all neatly organized. I had always assumed everything would go to her as any mother would. But for the first time, I questioned whether that was right. Why should I give the pieces of my life to someone who treated me like a burden? I closed the cabinet drawer with a sense of resolve. Something inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was making a decision for myself. And it was only the beginning. 2 days later, I stopped by my daughter's house unannounced. I told myself it was just to drop off some homemade soup for my grandson. He had always loved my chicken noodle recipe. But deep down, I wanted to see if she would welcome me or resent me for showing up. When she opened the door, her face immediately hardened. "Oh, hi, Mom," she said flatly, glancing behind her as though checking who might see me standing there. "I just made some soup for him," I said, holding up the container with a small smile. She hesitated before taking it. "Thanks, but next time, could you please call first? We're kind of busy." It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Dismissive, cold. I stepped back, feeling smaller than I had in years. "Of course," I said softly. Before I could even greet my grandson, she had already started to close the door. That was my breaking point. I walked slowly back to my car, carrying a pain that was strangely quiet, like a final nail being hammered into a coffin. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring at the house where I had once babysat him every weekend, where I had spent countless nights helping her when he was just a newborn. It hit me. Then she truly didn't want me in her life. When I got home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, letting the steam rise as my mind cleared. The love I had poured into her life no longer had a place to go. That night, as I prepared for bed, I heard my phone buzz. It was a message from her. "Mom, I know you mean well, but you really need to give us space. We're trying to build our own life. Please respect that." I stared at the words for a long time. No anger. No remorse. Just another reminder that I was an unwelcome guest in her world. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my journal and wrote, "Sometimes the cruelest words are the ones said calmly." Tonight I believe her. As I closed the journal, a calm resolve washed over me. The woman I used to be, the one who begged to be included, who tried endlessly to prove her worth, was gone. It was time to take back my dignity. I didn't know how yet, but my heart already knew. My goodbye wouldn't be loud. It would be silent. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely light, as if I'd finally stopped holding my breath after years of waiting for her love to return. I stood at my kitchen counter, my fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea, and looked out the window at the quiet street I had called home for decades. The world outside seemed the same, but inside something had shifted forever. I began to think practically, if I was truly going to walk away, I needed to do it with intention, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I pulled out my old planner, flipping through the empty pages I hadn't bothered to fill in for months. On a blank page, I wrote a single word at the top: freedom. Beneath it, I started a list: sort belongings, meet with lawyer, decide where to go, leave with dignity. The list looked simple, but each word carried decades of history, of sacrifices, of memories, of ties I was finally ready to cut. That afternoon, I opened my closet and took out the suitcases I hadn't used in years. As I ran my hands over the worn leather, I thought about all the trips I had planned to take, but never did. Life had always been about someone else, her needs, her milestones, her future. I pulled clothes off hangers, slowly, carefully folding each item. Some pieces carried memories I could almost smell and feel. My hands lingered on the faded cardigan I wore the night she graduated college, the pearl necklace I'd saved up for so I could look proud and put together on her wedding day. Piece by piece, I chose what to keep. Not much, just the things that were truly mine, not tied to a version of me that existed only for her. In the evening, I took out my box of keepsakes again: the baby shoes, the school drawings, the birthday cards she made for me as a little girl. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by decades of love, and let the memories wash over me. It hurt, but there was something healing about it too. I realized that no matter what she had become, no matter how cruel her words had been, I had been a good mother. I had loved her with everything I had, and that would never change. But now it was time to love myself with the same devotion. Later that night, I sat at my desk and opened the folder containing my will and financial documents. Everything, of course, was set to go to her: my modest savings, my home, my personal belongings. I stared at her name for a long time. It felt wrong. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Harper, the lawyer, who had helped me when I first bought my house. His warm, familiar voice answered on the second ring. "Grace, it's been a long time," he said. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. "I need to make some changes to my will. It's time." He didn't ask why. He just told me to come by next week, as if he could already hear in my voice that this wasn't a decision made lightly. When I hung up, I felt a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I was making choices for me, not for her, not for anyone else. The next day, I went to the grocery store and bought ingredients for my grandson's favorite cookies: peanut butter with chocolate drizzle. Baking them wasn't for my daughter. It was for him. Because as much as she had hurt me, he had never stopped running into my arms when I visited. That evening, I baked in silence, letting the smell of cookies fill the house. I carefully placed them in a tin and tied a ribbon around it. Then I wrote a small note: "For you, love always, Grandma." I didn't know when or if I would see him again after I left, but I wanted him to have one last reminder of me, not the version of me his mother resented, but the grandmother who had always loved him without conditions. When the cookies were done, I sat by the window with my tea and watched as the streetlights flickered on. I felt a strange mixture of sadness and peace. I knew that my goodbye wasn't going to be loud. There would be no confrontations, no dramatic speeches, no slamming doors. It would be a quiet disappearance. She would wake up one day to realize I was simply gone. No more visits, no more texts, no more efforts to stay in a life where I wasn't wanted. And with me, everything she had once assumed would be hers. My house, my savings, my legacy would be gone too. But it wasn't revenge. It was a reclamation of my worth. That night, I looked around my little house, the pictures on the walls, the books on the shelves, the memories tucked into every corner, and felt something I hadn't in years. Hope! Hope for a life where I wasn't someone's burden. Hope for mornings that didn't begin with waiting for someone to remember me. Hope for peace. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain: my quiet goodbye had already begun. The following week, I met with Mr. Harper, my lawyer. His office smelled faintly of old books and coffee, comforting in a way that reminded me of my years at the library. He looked at me over his glasses. Grace, you've always been careful with your affairs. What's changed? I smiled softly. Everything. I need to update my will. I don't want my daughter to inherit my house or my savings anymore. Not after everything that's happened. He nodded as though he'd heard this story too many times before from parents left behind by their own children. I understand. You're not the first mother to sit in that chair with this decision. Together, we went through the details. I had some savings, modest investments, and my house, my greatest asset. I'd like my assets to go to my grandson, I said, but only if he chooses to have a relationship with me when he's older. If not, I'd like them donated to the library I worked at for 40 years. Mr. Harper made notes, occasionally looking up to ask small clarifying questions. Do you want your daughter to know about these changes? No, I said firmly. She'll find out when the time comes. When we were done, I signed the papers with steady hands. I felt no guilt, only relief, like I had just closed a chapter that had been open far too long. Leaving the office, I stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the crisp air. I felt free but also deeply sad. This wasn't the life I'd imagined. I had thought that in my old age I'd be surrounded by family, by laughter, by the comfort of knowing I had raised a loving daughter. But life has a cruel way of humbling us. That night, back at home, I started sorting through my belongings more seriously. Each item felt like a fragment of my identity, my history. There were things I knew she wouldn't care about: my journals, my handwritten recipes, the quilt my mother made me before she died. I decided those things deserved better homes. I packed a small box of recipes and letters to give to a young woman from the neighborhood who loved baking and often came by to help me with errands. I planned to give my quilt to the local shelter, hoping it would warm someone who truly needed it. Piece by piece, I was redistributing the pieces of my life, not to my daughter, but to people who valued kindness, who still believed love meant something. As the days passed, I found myself feeling lighter. My house no longer felt like a cage of memories. Instead, it was becoming a stepping stone towards something new, something of my own. But I hadn't decided where I would go yet. One evening, as I sat by the window sipping tea, I looked at a postcard on my fridge. It was from a friend I hadn't seen in years who had moved to a quiet coastal town. The photo showed a small cottage overlooking the ocean, surrounded by wildflowers and winding paths. I traced the outline of the cottage with my finger and whispered, "Maybe that's where I'll go." The idea grew on me. A small place by the sea, no pressure, no expectations, just me and the sound of the waves. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I didn't know exactly when I would leave, but I knew that when I did, I wouldn't look back. Because sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is to let go. A week later, I called my grandson and asked if he wanted to come over for dinner. My daughter didn't answer my texts anymore, but thankfully, he was old enough now to have his own phone. He replied quickly, "Yes. Can I bring my favorite board game?" That evening, he came over with the game tucked under his arm, grinning like he always did when he saw me. His hugs were still tight, still warm, the kind that reminded me why I had held on for so long. I made all his favorites: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the cookies I'd baked just for him. We ate together at my small kitchen table, his chatter filling the quiet house. "Grandma," he said between bites, "why don't you come over more? I miss you." I forced a smile, my heart breaking at the innocence in his voice. "I miss you too, sweetheart. But sometimes grown-ups need space from each other." He frowned, clearly not understanding. "But you're my grandma. You can always come see me." I reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "I'll always love you. That will never change. But sometimes loving someone means knowing when to step back." He didn't fully grasp what I meant, and I didn't want him to. I just wanted that evening to be about joy, not loss. After dinner, we played his board game. We laughed. We teased each other over silly rules, and for a few precious hours, it felt like the old days when life was simple and love wasn't complicated. When it was time for him to go, I handed him the tin of cookies I had prepared. "These are just for you," I said softly. "Whenever you eat one, think of me, okay?" He hugged me so tightly that I had to blink back tears. As he walked out the door with his father, my son-in-law, who at least still greeted me kindly, I felt the ache of what I was about to lose. But I also knew this dinner was my gift to him. One last warm memory before everything changed. After they left, I sat in the quiet house, the smell of chicken and cookies still lingering in the air. I looked around at the walls filled with family photos, her wedding, his birth holidays that once felt like blessings. I stood up, took down one photo from the wall, a picture of me holding my newborn daughter in the hospital. I traced her tiny face with my fingertip. Then carefully I placed it in my suitcase. That would be the only photo I would take with me. It wasn't bitterness, it was closure. Because the woman in that picture, the mother who had given everything, deserved to be remembered. Even if my daughter didn't see her anymore, I still did. That night, I sat at my desk and began writing a letter. My dearest, this isn't goodbye forever. It's just me finally choosing myself. I have loved you with every piece of me, and I always will. But love cannot survive where it is not welcomed. I hope one day you'll understand that letting go was the hardest, but also the kindest thing I could do for both of us. Mom. I placed the letter in an envelope and set it on my dresser, knowing I'd leave it behind when I went. It was the first tangible step toward the life I was about to claim as my own. The morning after my grandson's visit, I woke up feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. The decision I had made was final. Now, there was no turning back. I brewed a pot of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and unfolded the letter I had written the night before. Reading it again, I felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of peace. There was nothing cruel in my words, just truth, the kind that had taken me decades to say out loud. Over the next few days, I tied up loose ends. I called the utility companies to set up final billing dates. I spoke with Mr. Harper one last time to finalize the new version of my will. My modest assets would now go to my grandson on the condition that he wanted them when he came of age. Otherwise, they would be donated to the library that had been my second home for 40 years. It felt right. I started packing my suitcase more intentionally now. A few clothes, some books I couldn't part with, my journals, and the single photo of me holding my newborn daughter. Everything else, every dish, every piece of furniture, every memory would stay behind. One evening, as I folded the last sweater into my bag, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't see a mother waiting to be included. I saw a woman who had finally chosen herself. But there was one thing left to do. The next morning, I drove to my daughter's house. She wasn't expecting me, but I didn't care. I rang the bell and waited. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face. Mom, what are you doing here? I smiled gently and handed her a small box. These are some things I thought you might want. Baby shoes, your old drawings. Memories. She looked down at the box, then back at me, clearly uncomfortable. Oh, thanks. You didn't have to. No, I said softly. I wanted to. She shifted her weight awkwardly, clearly unsure of what else to say. Well, we're about to head out, so. I nodded. I won't keep you. Before she could close the door, I added, take care of yourself. Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't ask why I said it like that. She just muttered a quick, yeah, you too, and shut the door. I stood on the porch for a moment, letting the cool air wash over me. That would be the last time I saw her for a long while, maybe forever. Driving home, I felt tears prick at my eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, I felt something more powerful than sadness. Closure. That night, I placed the letter on my dresser and looked around my house one final time. The walls were bare now, the shelves empty. It no longer looked like the home I had built over decades. It looked like a place I had already left behind. I climbed into bed, the packed suitcase by my side. For the first time in years, I slept soundly, knowing that in the morning I would walk away quietly and never look back. The morning of my departure came quietly without fanfare. The world outside was still half asleep, the sky painted in muted shades of gray and pink. I moved through my house with deliberate slowness, touching the walls, the furniture, the little details that had once made this place a home. I brewed one last pot of tea and sat at the kitchen table, letting the steam rise in slow spirals. It struck me how ordinary the moment felt, despite how monumental it truly was. When I finished my tea, I picked up the envelope containing the letter I had written to my daughter. I placed it neatly on the counter where I knew she'd find it someday, perhaps when she finally came looking for me. I zipped up my suitcase, grabbed my purse, and took one last look around. The pictures were gone, the shelves bare like the house itself knew I was leaving. As I stepped out onto the porch, the air was cool and damp. I locked the door for the last time and slid the key into an envelope addressed to Mr. Harper. He would handle everything from here on out. The walk to my car felt surreal. Each step echoed with the weight of years spent in this place. Years of joy, pain, sacrifice, and love that had gone unnoticed. I placed the suitcase in the trunk, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The soft hum filled the silence, grounding me in the reality of what I was about to do. Before pulling away, I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The house stood there still and quiet, a shell of memories that no longer belonged to me. I whispered softly, "Goodbye." The drive was long, but the miles felt liberating. With every town I passed, I felt lighter, as if pieces of my past were falling away behind me. Hours later, I arrived in the coastal town I had been dreaming about for weeks. The air smelled of salt and wildflowers, and the sound of waves crashing in the distance was like music to my ears. I found the small cottage I had rented, a modest place with white shutters and a porch swing. As I stepped inside, sunlight spilled across the wooden floors. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. I set my suitcase down and walked straight to the porch. From there, I could see the ocean stretching endlessly, its surface shimmering in the afternoon light. I sat on the swing, letting it sway gently as I breathed in the sea air. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting for a phone call, a visit, or a scrap of attention from someone who no longer valued me. I was simply free. That night, I slept with the windows open, listening to the waves. My heart felt heavy with grief, but light with possibility. I didn't know what the future held, but for once, that uncertainty didn't scare me, because the hardest part was already over. I had finally left, and in my leaving, I had found myself again. The days that followed felt almost unreal, as if I had stepped into someone else's life. My mornings began with the soft crash of waves and the distant cry of seagulls. I would brew a pot of coffee, sit on the porch swing, and watch the ocean change colors with the rising sun. There was a peace in this place I hadn't felt in decades. No hurried schedules, no strained conversations, no silent waiting for a call that would never come. I started exploring the small town. There was a quaint bookstore near the pier, its shelves lined with stories that smelled of old paper and salt air. The owner, a kind man named Thomas, greeted me warmly. "Haven't seen you around before," he said. "Just moved here," I replied with a small smile. He handed me a bookmark with the shop's name on it. "Welcome. New faces are always good for new stories." Those words stayed with me. New stories. Maybe that was exactly what I needed. As the days turned into weeks, I began to build small routines. Morning walks along the beach, afternoons spent reading by the window, evenings where I'd cook simple meals just for myself. It felt strange at first, but slowly it became comforting. I even started volunteering at the local library a few afternoons each week. It reminded me of the life I had loved before motherhood consumed every part of me, the quiet joy of helping a child pick out their first chapter book, the warm camaraderie of discussing novels with strangers who loved stories as much as I did. One afternoon, while shelving books, I caught myself laughing at a silly joke told by one of the librarians. It struck me how long it had been since I had laughed like that freely without forcing it for someone else's comfort. But even in this newfound peace, there were moments when grief would wash over me unexpectedly. I would see a mother and daughter walking hand in hand along the shore and feel a sharp pang in my chest. I would think of my grandson and wonder if he missed me, if he still remembered my hugs or my cookies. Sometimes late at night, I'd reach for my phone instinctively, only to remember there was no one waiting on the other end. But then I'd remind myself I hadn't left out of anger. I had left because I finally realized I deserved more than being tolerated. And slowly I began to understand that my life, my happiness, didn't have to be tied to her acceptance anymore. One evening, I sat on the porch, notebook in hand, as the sun dipped below the horizon. I began to write not letters this time, but my own story. My memories, my thoughts, my quiet victories and heartbreaks. It felt powerful reclaiming my voice after so many years of silence. That night, as I closed the notebook, I whispered to myself, I'm still here. I'm still me. And for the first time, that was enough. Back in my old town, word of my disappearance started to spread. It began with my daughter calling my phone repeatedly. When I didn't answer, she drove to my house only to find it empty. The curtains were gone, the shelves bare, the furniture covered with sheets. On the kitchen counter sat the envelope with her name written neatly on the front. She opened it and read my letter. I can only imagine her face as her eyes moved over the words. Words that carried no bitterness, no accusation, just truth. She must have realized then that I wasn't coming back. For the first time in her life, she no longer had access to the mother she had always taken for granted. At first, she must have assumed I'd come crawling back eventually, but days turned into weeks and weeks into months. My number stayed disconnected. My old house was sold. My possessions, those she assumed would one day be hers, were gone. I knew because Mr. Harper wrote me a short letter one afternoon, letting me know the house sale had gone through smoothly and that my will had been updated. Your daughter came by to ask questions, he wrote at the end. She looked surprised, maybe even hurt, but I told her everything was already finalized. Reading those words, I felt no satisfaction. What I felt was something deeper, something quieter, justice. Because for years I had begged for a place in her life. I had endured every sigh, every cold remark, every dismissal, hoping she would one day remember the love I'd given her. But she hadn't. And now she couldn't assume I'd always be there. I imagined her walking through my empty house, looking at the blank walls where family photos had once hung, realizing that everything she had taken for granted was gone. Maybe she would cry. Maybe she would curse me. Maybe she would feel nothing at all. But whatever she felt, it didn't matter anymore. Because my life was finally mine. That evening, I sat on the porch of my seaside cottage watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sky turned brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the waves shimmered under the fading light. I thought of my grandson. I missed him terribly, but I knew I had left him a piece of me, my love, my memories, and a legacy he could one day choose to embrace or leave behind. As the stars began to appear, I whispered softly to the night, I hope you understand one day why I left, and I hope you'll forgive me. The ocean answered in its steady rhythm, a reminder that life moves forward always. And so did I. Weeks later, I received a letter at my new cottage. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my daughter's. My heart pounded as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. Mom, I don't know where you are, but I went to the house. It was empty. I found your letter. I don't know what to say. I didn't think you'd ever leave. I thought you'd always be there no matter what. I guess I didn't realize how much I hurt you. Maybe I didn't want to. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't know if it's too late, but I miss you. So does your grandson. Please write back. Tears welled in my eyes as I read her words. For years I had longed for an apology. Now that I finally had one, it felt bittersweet, like rain falling on ground that had already hardened. I placed the letter on my table and stared at it for a long time. I could have written back. Right then, told her where I was, told her that I forgave her. But I didn't. Instead, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my journal. Because forgiveness wasn't something I could give just yet. It wasn't that I hated her, I didn't. But trust once broken so many times didn't return with a single apology. I needed time. The next day, I went for a walk along the beach, letting the cold waves lap at my feet. I thought about the letter, about the years of sacrifices and disappointments, about the night she screamed at me in front of her friends. I realized something important that day. I wasn't leaving her out of my life forever. I was just no longer living my life for her approval. That evening, I sat at my desk and wrote a reply, not one that gave her everything she wanted, but one that was honest. I got your letter. I appreciate your words, and I hope you mean them. I need time for myself, for healing, for everything we lost along the way. I love you, but love needs more than words. Maybe someday we'll find our way back to each other. Until then, take care of yourself and my grandson. Mom, I sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing mail. When I set it down, I felt something release inside me, a quiet, unshakable strength. For the first time in decades, I was no longer waiting for her to choose me. I had chosen myself. The days passed slowly after I sent my reply. Part of me wondered if I had been too cold, too distant, but deep down I knew it was the right choice. My daughter sent another letter weeks later. This one was longer, filled with memories, stories from her childhood, little details she hadn't mentioned in years. I remember the way you used to braid my hair before school. I remember the smell of cookies in the house when I got home. I remember you cheering the loudest at every recital, every game, every milestone. I don't know why I forgot all of that when I grew up. I guess I thought you'd always be there, so I stopped appreciating you. I was wrong, Mom. You didn't deserve how I treated you. Please just tell me you're okay, even if you can't forgive me yet. I cried as I read it, tears falling silently onto the page. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was grief for everything we had lost. But grief didn't erase the years of hurt. I wrote back once more, "Thank you for remembering. Those were some of the happiest days of my life. I am safe and I am well. I need more time. This space is helping me find myself again, something I should have done long ago. I love you, but forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Maybe someday we'll see each other again. But for now, I need to keep living my own story." Mom. After mailing it, I stood at the edge of the ocean watching the waves crash and retreat again and again. Life was like that, constantly giving and taking, building and erasing. That evening, I went to the library where I had begun volunteering. A little girl came up to me clutching a book almost as big as her head. "Can you help me read this?" she asked shyly. I smiled and sat down beside her, my heart warming as I helped her sound out the words. In that moment, I realized something powerful. Even if my daughter never fully came back to me, my life still had meaning. I still had love to give, just in different places to different people. I didn't need to beg for a place in someone's life. I already belonged to myself. Months passed, and my new life by the sea slowly became home. The quiet cottage, the familiar sound of waves, the warm faces in town, they all became part of a world that no longer felt temporary. My daughter wrote occasionally, each letter softer, humbler than the last. She didn't beg anymore. Instead, she shared updates about my grandson, how he was excelling in school, how he still asked about me. Each letter I received was a reminder that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. But I didn't rush it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The air was cool and the sky was streaked with brilliant shades of orange and purple. I thought about everything that had happened, the years of giving, the pain of rejection, and the strength it took to finally walk away. I realized something profound. Leaving hadn't been about punishing her. It had been about saving myself. I had spent a lifetime proving my love. Now I was proving my worth to me. That night, I took out my journal and wrote, "I am not a burden. I am not invisible. I am a mother, a woman, a human being who deserves to be loved freely, not tolerated out of duty. My life is mine again." I closed the journal and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I didn't know if my daughter and I would ever fully reconcile. Maybe we would, maybe we wouldn't. But I finally understood that I could still live a full, meaningful life either way. As the stars began to appear, I whispered to the night, "Thank you for giving me the courage to leave." And for the first time in decades, I felt completely free. Have you ever had to walk away quietly to protect your own dignity? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. If this story touched you, subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of strength, healing, and second chances.